Thank you and welcome back. Our final session of the day is Adaptation and Remediation. And we are fortunate to have our moderator, Somini Sengupta, moderate for us again. She's kindly doing double duty for us. And as you know, she was featured this morning in the first session where she did a fabulous job framing the symposium. Just to remind everyone, Somini is the international climate reporter for the New York Times, and she will introduce the speakers. Thank you, Somini.
Thank you for soldiering on a Friday afternoon. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I really look forward to learning a lot from all of you. To my left, Klaus Lackner, Director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions and Professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University. In the middle, Lis Mullin Bernhardt, Deputy Head for the Freshwater Division of the UN Environment Program based in Nairobi. And Sanjay Seth, former Climate Resilience Program Manager for the City of Boston. So, welcome. Who should I invite first? I think I should invite you first, since I introduced you first.
Okay,
all right, so Professor Lackner will make his presentation first.
Good evening, everybody. And I think I'm going in a slightly different direction right now. I start out with the observation, we broke the climate, and we will have to fix it. And so we are talking about that from a technology perspective, but also from a policy and regulatory perspective, because I think that's equally important. Fixing it, if we broke it, in many ways is a justice issue and an intergenerational equity issue in particular. I think the polluter pay principle should be applied, and we have to clean up after ourselves, and there's a lot of fossil carbon we put out. I would point out, even if we try to fix it, we cannot rewind the clock. So whatever we have already done will cause us damages. Some people, like Jim Hansen, have said, and this is now nearly quaint, that at 350 ppm we should have stopped. So it is not utterly clear to me that we can stay where we are and that we have to not unroll back to 350. But even if we succeed with that, that is not the same as having stayed at 350. So we cannot unwind the clock, but we have to work and get there. If you look at the climate problem from a simple-minded physicist perspective, how I stumbled into this thing some 30 years ago, it's mainly the release of carbon into the environment. We are digging up fossil carbon. We are calcining limestone and dolomite in steel plants and cement plants. And all of that carbon dioxide piles up in the atmosphere. And unlike the methane, it actually doesn't go away. It stays there on a human time scale forever, maybe 100,000 years, 50,000 to 100,000 years. And that's what I mean when I said the polluter has to clean up. It's not just for our generation, but for all the generations which follow us. So we need to track that carbon and we need to get rid of it. I would argue we have reached a point where this means we have to have a technology. This is something beyond what nature will do by itself. It will take 100,000 years to do it. And it's too much for agriculture or forestry to pick up. To give you a feeling, if you wanted to absorb 40 gigatons a year, this is what we are doing right now, you would have to commit an area of sunshine to do photosynthesis, which is bigger than all of agricultural areas. Do you really want to change the environment that dramatically? Do you really want to compete with food production at that scale? So we will need technological solutions to do that. I would argue direct air capture. I probably, in some ways, am the first one to have loudly said this needs to be done. Can collect this much. Sequestration can put that much away. In the 90s said we need to do mineral sequestration. I can live with geological sequestration. We have permanent ways of putting stuff away at that scale. Let me give you another point on the 40 gigatons a year. If we want to get 100 ppm back, we need to, for 40 years, pull 40 gigatons a year out of the atmosphere to make that happen. So whatever scale we are talking about, I think it's larger than the 5 to 10 gigatons a year the IPCC has been talking about. We are talking 40, 50 gigatons a year, even if we phase out fossil energy as fast as we possibly can. I think there's no question anymore that direct air capture works. Go to Kleinbergs in Iceland, and I hate to do this with a competitor, but it's certainly true. They are there. They are doing it. The only problem right now is they are roughly 10 times too expensive. At $500 a ton, this is an expensive proposition. By the way, it's $50 a kilogram or 25 cents a pound. So don't think about this as being ridiculously expensive. But if the world wants to afford these kind of scales of things and not ruin the world economy, we better get roughly 10 times cheaper. At $50, you would add the cost of the CO2 from a gallon of gasoline would be 40 cents. We could clearly afford that if we chose to do it. So how can we get 10 times cheaper? Mass production has done this. It has done it for PV, for photovoltaic energy. It is today literally 100 times cheaper than it was in the 1970s. And with every doubling in output, that price dropped 20%, which is roughly saying if you grow 1,000-fold, you get 10 times better. Direct air capture today is kilotons per year. By the time we reach megatons a year, we could have driven the prices down. Just like you heard earlier, all these nifty technologies got cheap, and now we can actually have them. These technologies are a generation behind because nobody ever wanted them. But they can get down a factor 10 as well if we start coming down what's called the learning curve, which may or may not be learning, and find our way there. But I think the real problem is not technology itself. We have to figure out how to apply that technology and figure out a way of making it practical. And for that, I think the first thing you need standards and you need regulations. As long as it's free to dump CO2 into the atmosphere, you don't really want to think about it that way. You really should start thinking about CO2 as a waste management problem. We dig up fossil carbon because it has energy. We extract the energy. Now we have CO2. We don't know what to do with it, and we just dump it into the atmosphere. If you start thinking about it as waste you need to clean up, then you need several things. One is you need a rule which says you must clean up. And the second part is you need some certification mechanism which actually tells you that you have cleaned up. So if you can have direct air capture and sequestration, you can clean up after yourself. We now need certification methods which allow us to actually implement that. And you need permanent storage, and you need to be able to certify that storage is permanent. And if you have storage which is temporary, that is perfectly okay, as long as you are capable of taking the guarantee that if you lose it, you do it again. The certificate should say, it is put away, don't have to worry about it anymore. I, the operator, the storage operator, have to account for the carbon I have, and if I lose it, I have to give it back. Ultimately, and this is where we are quite radical about it, these certificates you now need to apply somewhere. And I would argue the last place where you really know how much carbon you had is right when it came out of the ground, either at the extraction of a mine or a well, a gas well or oil well, or for that matter at a cement plant where you calcite limestone to lime. We know exactly how much is there, and at that point, you better show me a certificate of sequestration to be permitted to do that. If this were uniformly applied, the world would be in balance. You could then buy additional certificates to actually create what we call negative emissions. You need those regulations, and I think you need them fast. In a way, we now have no excuse anymore not to deal with the carbon problem. We know that it causes climate change, and so we should start tomorrow. Of course, I'm idealist here right now, but we should start tomorrow, and we understand that we can't have enough sequestration overnight. But you could demand that you buy a future on that, and that future has to be served later, and that we can get over that hump and gradually remove everything. But the liability for every ton of carbon coming out of the ground, in my view, should start today. If you can balance the carbon books that way, that would be a very different world. Among other things, direct air capture could also help you to get renewable energy to penetrate deeply into the environment. because you could have 100%. Because people say, well, we can't deal with ships, we can't deal with heavy trucks, we can't deal with airplanes. Well, we can. We can take CO2 from the atmosphere, we can electrolyze water to hydrogen and oxygen, and if you give me hydrogen and oxygen, I can show you technologies from the 1920s which can convert that into methanol, gasoline, methane, diesel, jet fuel. All of these things we can make if we choose to. So we can abandon fossil fuels and then let the markets figure out how far this will actually go. If you don't, the advantage of having to remove the carbon and have to pay for it puts you suddenly that the renewable energy looks much better in this competition. And so we have the ability to do that. And then if you buy certificates and don't use them to cancel out brand new emissions, you can create negative emissions. And I think we, the North, the Western world in particular, we owe the rest of the world an awful lot of carbon. And that carbon should be collected and removed on our nickel. And furthermore, it is incredibly important that the developing countries can develop, and we may have to pay for their carbon removal, either directly or indirectly, by doing things like that. And I'll end on that, and thank you for your attention.
Please take it away.
Thank you so much, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you today. My name's Liz. I'm from the UN's version of the EPA, to put that in language I think everyone will understand, the UN Environment Program based in Nairobi, Kenya. And we're coming to the end of a day of pretty amazing speakers. And I want to say that I am extremely grateful to be here today. I want to thank the organizers for having me. I want to thank you for putting on such an amazing symposium, for giving people like me the opportunity to also learn and to meet you. Very grateful to be here. And I wanted to give a bit of a perspective that might be a little bit different from what you've already heard today, because we've already heard a lot about what's causing climate change and what the impacts are likely to be and already are. What I wanted to talk about is what the United Nations, specifically what UNEP is doing to build climate resilience through protecting and restoring nature. First off, we heard this morning from Dr. Marshall. He eloquently said that sometimes in the climate space, we have a serious gap between what we know, the science we know, and how we're communicating it. So I'm going to take a lesson from him and just put my 3 key messages up here right at front. And since, Somini, you mentioned earlier today that you are neither a climate optimist nor are you really a climate pessimist, but I thought I should out myself and say that I am a climate optimist. I think that we all have to be. Because if we don't believe in a better future for ourselves and our children, how are we going to get countries to go towards that vision? We have to envision that and move towards it. So here are my 3 main messages that I'd like to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to further discussions and questions. But the first message, as we heard earlier today from another panelist, is that all of us are already on the front lines of climate change, and I just want to underscore that. The second message is that we often talk about nature and ecosystems as the poor victim of climate change. They're feeling the impacts of what climate change is doing and what we are doing to nature. That is true. But they are also not innocent bystanders. Nature and ecosystems are actually very strong advocates. They can be and are heroes that can combat the impacts of climate change and the causes of climate change. And so we should be treating nature as one of our climate heroes and our allies. And the third thing is that despite what some news sources might say, I'm not saying anyone here feels that way, but we at the UN, that means our 193 member states and the secretariat that I represent, we do care, and we are doing something about climate change. So this country might look familiar to you. I've just chosen it completely at random from our 193 member states. But in the United States, no matter where you live, whether you're in the Midwest, which is where I am from and where my mom still lives, hi Mom, or whether you're from California, where a lot of my family lives, hi Uncle Bob and Aunt Dodie, or from the East Coast, where many of my UN colleagues and friends live. Wherever you are in the United States, as we heard earlier this morning, climate change is already in our DNA. The impacts that we're seeing all over the world, or all over this country, from drought, aridification, flooding, wherever you are, if you're on the coast or along rivers, extreme storms, heat, and wildfires, you're already feeling the impacts, and we can expect those impacts to become more extreme and more frequent, as we know. But we also may start seeing impacts that we haven't yet seen before. Think snowstorms or ice in Texas. As Katharine Hayhoe put it recently in her book, Saving Us, if anyone has read it, or if you haven't read it, I recommend it. She said that where we've been in the past is no prediction for what we might see in the future for climate change. That's one of the things that makes it so pernicious. But we're seeing that already all over the United States. And it's not just the United States. If you're from Germany, which is where the city of Bonn, where my husband and children were born, Germany is also on the front lines of climate change. This picture is the same river taken exactly 1 year apart. On the left, you see the Ahr River, which is right outside our town of Bonn, one of our favorite places to hike and grab a glass of wine. It experienced extreme flash floods in the summer of July 2021. We were bailing out water in our basement and our elderly neighbor's basement that day. And exactly 1 year later, this past summer in Europe, we were there again with family, and the same river, it's a different spot of the river, but the same river dried up for the first time in its history and did not reach the Rhine. And that happened to rivers all over Europe this summer. The source of the Thames, the Loire, the Po in Italy. We saw rivers drying up all over, and we saw Europe really experiencing its worst drought in 500 years. So Germany and Europe, too, are on the front lines of climate change. And certainly where I live now with my family in Kenya, there is no doubt that we are on the front lines of climate change. I chose this picture to show you where Kenya is located. You might recognize it as the picture on our poster for this symposium, but if you look right in the center of that beautiful globe, Kenya is pretty much right there. It's right at the edge of the very arid north of the continent and the much greener southern part of the continent. And so we really experience these extreme climate extremes often in the same country at the same time. Right now we're experiencing one of the worst droughts the Horn of Africa has ever seen, accompanied by famine. But we can also just as easily be flooded. And that's because, as you can see on this map as well, we're just to the east of the beautiful Congo Basin, which is one of the lungs of the world. So we see that happening in Kenya, most certainly. And truly, as Deborah, you already mentioned earlier today, we cannot ignore the science anymore. This recent figure from the IPCC shows that we are seeing climate change impact our ecosystems in every region of the world, and that is changing the structure of ecosystems, the range of species that are shifting, and we are even seeing changes in phenology. I knew that you would appreciate if I used that word. Changes in the timing of when key events actually are happening. And we have a very, very high certainty that this is attributable to climate change. The darker the dot, the more certain we are that those changes are because of human-induced climate change. So my second message, and this is where it gets a little bit more hopeful, is that nature can help us combat climate change, both its impacts and its causes. A recent report that we put out here, you can see on the screen, is that we estimate that NBS, such as forests, grasslands, croplands, peatlands, and other wetlands, or marine ecosystems like sea kelp and seagrass, that they could remove at least 5 and up to 11 gigatons of CO2 per year, which could rise to 18 gigatons per year by 2050. And that is a significant portion of our mitigation needs. We also estimate that by protecting forests and mangroves, we could prevent economic losses from climate change by up to $534 billion annually. And these ecosystems really, of course, form natural ecosystems, the very most basic and cheapest carbon storage technology you can imagine, because they do absorb carbon emissions. But it's not just for mitigation purposes. Perhaps just as importantly, we know that nature has serious benefits for us to adapt to climate change. Forests and other natural ecosystems can provide significant benefits of urban cooling, of filtering our air, of mitigating stormwater and saving energy. And wetlands and mangroves and other coastal ecosystems can provide water storage and filtration, lessening the impacts of storms and flooding. So there's a million good reasons to protect nature. This is just another one of them. Finally, and my last key message is what we, meaning the UN or UNEP specifically, what we're doing about it. And we do have what we call a mitigation imperative. First and foremost, our job at the UN has to be to help countries make commitments, keep their promises, and increase their ambition to reach their commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think there's a get-out-of-jail-free card for this. We must keep trying to reduce our emissions. We must do it faster. So far, the commitments that countries have made would only result in a 7.5% reduction in emissions by the year 2030. But what we need is a 30% reduction in emissions to keep global warming to 2 degrees, and a 55% reduction to keep it to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So we know we have to bend that curve extremely, extremely fast. We cannot give up on that quest, as daunting as it obviously is at the moment, because the existing commitments that countries have made would result in a warming of 2.7 degrees by the end of this century. And that's something we just can't afford. 1.1 degrees is already pretty tough to tolerate. What that means is that we know that countries also have an adaptation imperative. We know that even if we did stop these emissions right now, that we would still be feeling the impacts of climate change for a long time to come. So we have to be better at anticipating them, at getting ready for them, and that's the core of what we're trying to do in climate resilience. One of the recent estimates that we've made is that up to or between $140 billion and $300 billion per year will be needed by the year 2030, and that this could double or even be higher than that, as we've heard. This is a huge amount. It's a big price tag, but it is a doable amount. You just have to imagine and remember how quickly we're able to mobilize finances when we declare emergencies of any kind, whether it's a war or a global pandemic or an economic crisis to save any failing bank or industry that we need to. We can and do find the money when we need to. We need to treat the climate crisis like the crisis that it is and mobilize what needs to be done. And the first thing that needs to be done is really redressing or balancing out the amount of money that's going towards mitigation versus adaptation. Our Secretary General recently called to member states around the world to make this a 50-50 parity, that at least half the money is going to adaptation. But currently the amount is only 7% going to adaptation and 93% going to reduction of greenhouse gases. So we urgently need to tip that in the other direction, find more money for climate finance in general. And we are seeing these flows go towards adaptation, flows in attention, flows in money. These are some of the things that UNEP and many other UN organizations are doing to help build capacity for countries to use and implement what we call nature-based solutions for their governments and for communities. We're helping countries develop methods and tools to aid and improve planning for adaptation and decision-making. We're helping to improve the access that countries can get to timely knowledge and information. We are setting up early warning systems and advisories and helping to enhance climate resilience through planning and promoting the sharing of knowledge. Currently, we have projects in more than 50 countries in the world, growing almost by the month, 70 projects to a total of $340 million US. This is just a drop in the bucket to what many other organizations are doing around the world. But we have these kinds of projects happening everywhere, like I've just mentioned. One thing that I find particularly exciting that we're doing, and we need to do more of, is focusing on early warning systems. It doesn't sound that cool, but in fact, it's an amazing return on investment with amazing also results. We estimate that just 24 hours of advance warning or knowledge of an approaching storm or heat wave can reduce the consequent damage, including loss of life, by 30%. It's also a very cost-effective return on investment. Investing in early warning systems generates an average of $9 of benefits for every dollar that you spend. And this is even more so the case in developing countries. But here again, there's a gap, there's more work to do. 1/3 of the global population still isn't covered by early warning systems. So that's a part of the world that we urgently do need to address. Another thing that really excites me, and I have the benefit of not living in the States or Europe, so I can see how quickly things are changing when you step out and step back in. But what we see changing around the world in terms of green infrastructure and energy is extremely exciting. And we're also understanding that often this kind of infrastructure can be less expensive and have a lot of other co-benefits, like reducing stormwater runoff, reducing the temperature inside buildings in heat waves, or reducing energy costs. We're seeing an amazing technologies come. And we also see the potential for these, for green infrastructure to help create jobs, increase food security. And that's really the crux of the infrastructure bill that the United States has just passed. Congratulations, by the way. But this idea that moving to green growth can actually help economies. I will say very briefly, because I'm sure this question could come up, but we are also seeing progress on one of the most contentious issues in the United Nations. One of the reasons it's taken so long to make progress is the idea that those who were least responsible for climate change and most vulnerable should be compensated by those who caused climate change. So this idea of financing loss and damage, financing adaptation, is gaining ground. Last year at our climate change conference, we agreed on a framework to make that happen, and I'm hoping that in a few weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh, we'll actually make serious progress in this direction. Finally, I just want to end on something that's very exciting to me as an example of what is possible. The Great Green Wall Initiative, if you don't know about it, it's an African-led movement across the continent of Africa, across 11 countries, aiming to restore 250 million acres or 100 million hectares of land, create 10 million jobs, and sequester 250 megatons of carbon. It's actually a 9-mile wide, 5,000-mile long natural barrier, like a wall of trees, fighting encroaching desertification. It's just received a funding boost, and when it's completed, it will be the largest living structure on Earth, even several times bigger than the Great Barrier Reef. But this kind of vision is something that we should all believe in and work towards. I'm going to leave you on this slide. You can find out more information about the UN and UNEP's work at these sites, and I thank you for your time.
Sanjay, please.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Sanjay Seth. Thank you for having me here today. I'm actually formerly a graduate of the Kennedy School and the Design School. I used to manage the City of Boston's climate adaptation program, and now I serve as Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor for Climate Equity at the Environmental Protection Agency in Region 1. Just disclaimer today, all of my opinions here are my own. I'm here in my personal capacity. Okay, that aside, let's dive in. So today, what I really want to do is just share with you kind of a frustration that I have as an adaptation practitioner and a way to kind of get at it. So often when we talk about adaptation, we're really focusing on two parts of a framework. We're focusing on the pace of climate change and the impacts that we're seeing, and then how do we deal with that? And one of the wrinkles in all of this is that there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle that sometimes get kind of pushed to the back in the conversation on climate change. And so what I'm hoping to do in 9 minutes is to tease out some of these pieces that I like to think about when I think about, okay, how do you actually address this problem holistically? And then I'll give you 3 kind of conclusions I draw from that. This is going to go a little quickly. But first, let's start with what everyone knows, which is we live on a warming planet, the pace of climate change is increasing every year, and we need to act in a timely manner. The question is, will we do that in time to effectively protect people and their livelihoods? Will we do that effectively in time in general? And so this is a very familiar question. This is something we all wrestle with on a regular basis in climate change. And we wrestle with it in the context of the impacts, which touch really every part of the human existence. And when we think about these impacts, we've all seen, and we've all talked about a lot of these direct impacts like sea level rise and heat waves and storms and droughts. And we talk much less about, what does it mean to live in a world where we see sea level rise? What does it mean socially, economically? What does it mean for these compounding effects to be occurring at the same time? I believe in our last panel, someone was talking about a hurricane amplifying a flood, amplifying, vulnerable communities that are already experiencing these crises. These things come together all at once. And what do we mean by when we say impacts? And I think there's a lot of work we can do there. And when we start zooming out a little bit and we start thinking about the secondary impacts, the tertiary impacts, the system of cumulative impacts, all of a sudden we have an opportunity to come at this work with a much more creative policy lens, but also bring more disciplines into the conversation. Third, in terms of a framework, so what I'm sharing with you are several steps of a framework of thinking about climate adaptation. This one is increasingly in the conversation, the distribution of climate risk, distribution globally in terms of which countries cause the problem, which countries are bearing the initial risks, but also distribution temporally. A lot of the people that are going to be most affected by climate change aren't even born yet. And that's an interesting question to Klaus's point earlier about intergenerational justice, or this kind of question of polluter pays. There's a lot of stories here about the distribution of climate change that track alongside a lot of the other policy challenges that we face around housing, around transportation, around access to open space. A lot of these things track in a similar way, and when we think about the distribution of these risks, what we ask ourselves then is how does that affect the ability or the willingness to act with a sense of urgency on climate change and to really take these hard burdens on today so that folks don't experience them in the future? That's a question adaptation always asks. Fourth, this question of the presence of tipping points, and this is kind of like a glib phrase now at this point, but really what I'm trying to get at is, imagine walking down an open street in Boston. You can walk in any direction, it's a wonderful day, and then all of a sudden you find yourself 1 second later down in a tunnel with one direction to go and it's dimly lit, right? There are moments in the climate crisis where the decisions we thought we had can change suddenly. And then the things that we thought were protective or the pathways that we thought we could hit to keep ourselves safe, to protect our families, are no longer available to us and we have to adjust. This is a constant question in climate adaptation, which is, are you building an adaptation pathway that's fragile, that's on a knife's edge, and if you're wrong by just a little bit here or there, your solutions won't survive? Or are you building really complex, resilient approaches to addressing climate change that even if you're wrong by a little bit, or even if the future is not quite what we thought it was, we still have a pathway to safety. We still have actually a positive pathway. The goal really of adaptation isn't just avoiding risks, but it's about addressing a lot of the historic harms that we've already faced and we've already seen in our daily lives. Fifth, patterns of human behavior. So this year, today's actually my birthday, 34 years it took me to become a morning person. And when you think about all of the deeply embedded behaviors that are affected by climate change, that affect our outcomes, whether that's where you live, where you work, the kind of work you do, how you save, your family, the way you even plan for emergencies or just basic everyday things. All of those things affect your outcomes in terms of climate change, and you have to change all of these different micro behaviors at the individual level, and then macro behaviors. And this question, when it comes to adaptation, is really, what's it going to take? What does it mean for each of us to not just change micro behaviors about where we walk, how we walk, to avoid heat stress, or anyway, there's a million behaviors you could think of, but this is really complicated in the question of adaptation because it often touches the sacred. It touches our ideas of home, of place, of where we've been our whole lives. And when you come up with solutions that seem to threaten that, it can be really challenging to have this conversation on adaptation. Sixth, the capacity of governance. So clearly, as climate change progresses, if we do not act effectively, if we do not act decisively and correctly, the capacity of governance to respond can fray. And right when you need government the most, if you are not progressively digging deeper and deeper on adaptation, you won't be able to have the capacity, the political legitimacy, and the viability of your democratic process or to actually make these hard decisions. So the last part of this framework, and then I'll transition to my 3 points, which is really pace, impacts, distribution of climate risk, tipping points, behavior, and capacity. All of those 6 things come together in a question of what is the value of adaptation? For whom, right? The most important part of adaptation, which is often subsumed in these giant conversations about climate change, is that it's about each of us. It's about each person. And that the value of adaptation, where you are, who you are, your experience, what time you're in. You know, the value of adaptation in Mauritius in 2050 might be very different for someone who's an Indian guy in Boston in 2022, and the choices we make are really different. But that the way this value plays out across different people and histories and impacts and experiences, that's where the conversation needs to be, because this isn't a general conversation about adaptation. This is about a decision each of us make every day in our lives. And we have to continue making over and over again. So that was a really quick thing. I could spend a term on that. There's a lot of, like, as someone who's a climate adaptation practitioner, there's a lot of policy opportunity that comes from thinking about many layers that aren't even here, and trying to plot them on a timeline, plot them on kind of a matrix of how people make decisions, and really think, what are we doing here? How are we actually going to solve this problem? It seems so knotted. And so, you know, we'll have a whole panel to discuss that, but I really want to get to the 3 takeaways that I take as a climate adaptation practitioner, which is we're not going to solve this unless we're putting people and livelihoods first. Ultimately, the conversation on climate change, in climate adaptation in particular, tends to focus on the things that don't move, on land, on buildings, on property in general. It doesn't often start with the person. It doesn't often start with the experience in your body, your mental health, your heat. I love the conversation earlier in the previous panel because that's the kind of direction that connects with people and their own experiences of climate change, and not just kind of these epic conversations about global crises. You know, there's a lot of ways you can bring this to a person, but where it really comes down to earth is when we're thinking about protecting people from sea level rise. Is it about keeping the water out of their home? Is it about keeping people away from high-risk areas? You know, there's a lot of complexity there if they're renters. If you're protecting an area that otherwise would bear a lot of flood risk, you're increasing the value of land behind that area. If they're renters, they might have to move somewhere else. So by focusing on the person, you're not only creating a better politics of climate adaptation and helping people understand how they matter in the question, but you're also focusing more clearly and explicitly on the problems, the intersectional problems that you're trying to address. Similarly, my second point is really just, you know, talking to people, coming up with solutions at a systems level is complicated. But really, the more that we are thinking about what does it mean to live in a world where sea level rise is happening? If sea level rise is happening, there's 40 other impacts happening at the same time. How do we think about adaptation socially and economically, much more broadly and much more explicitly than keeping water, raising the coastal edge to keep water out of your community? That's important, but that's a part of a really, really interwoven puzzle. And lastly, you know, I was trying to come up with a definition of climate adaptation, and this is probably not it for me, but this worked last night, which was climate adaptation is about people making complex decisions under increasingly stressful conditions, right? If we focus on the people and the decisions they're making, I think we open up way more policy options than we currently see in the climate adaptation space and we currently use in the climate adaptation space. We're often focused on physical and engineering issues, or maybe we're thinking about questions of someone's health being affected in a specific way. But how are they making those decisions? What decisions led them to that moment? I think the more that we center our adaptation on the people and the decisions they're making, I think the more interdisciplinary our work can be, the more intersectional, and ultimately the more just our outcomes can be in terms of actually getting to those outcomes that we want to see in terms of climate change. So I just want to say thank you again for the invitation to join this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
So many questions. I'm going to start with you, Sanjay, because it's fresh in my head, and you mentioned it. How do you deal with a rising sea in a city like Boston, or many others? I mean, some of our greatest cities are on the coast. Airports, stock markets, universities. I mean, some of our, So I want to ask you about how you think about this, right? There's an abiding debate about whether to keep back the water or to let in the water. Walls versus wetlands maybe is a shorthand, and this impacts development decisions, of course. Can you think of a specific example where that shows the limits of each?
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic question in adaptation, right? Walls versus wetlands, or how do we even think about our coastal edges, right? There are a number of cities that are on the coastal edge. Almost all of our largest cities in the world are on the coastal edge, and so this is something that's relevant to every city. I think one particular example, if we're just looking at the greater Boston area, you can look at a place called Belle Isle Marsh, right? It's in East Boston, and it's one of the largest remaining salt marshes in Massachusetts. It's also one of the only urban salt marshes of that size in New England. And so when we think about what happens in that space, it's really complicated, because you also have the Blue Line. The Blue Line is a subway line that provides connection from an environmental justice community into the city of Boston. It's a critical lifeline, and it abuts one of the main evacuation corridors of the city of Boston. So when you think about this conversation, which is often very polarized, I want walls or I want wetlands, it's really complex when you bring it down to an urban context, because if you don't protect the evacuation corridor, if you don't protect the main transportation line with some kind of wall, what are you really doing in this environmental justice community? Why do other people get this kind of protection? Why is this area going to be for nature? Mm-hmm. And so I think, providing an equal level of protection to everyone in this case means that you might be raising the elevation right next to a marsh. And often the conversation about marshes, so marshes sometimes, they've been keeping up with sea level rise ever since, and it's just because we've been putting more carbon into the atmosphere that they're starting to be threatened. But they can only gain in elevation at a certain rate. And so when we think about the value of marshes, they're incredibly valuable ecologically, but you kind of have to make a choice in some communities. What are you prioritizing? And ideally you prioritize both. Ideally you prioritize the resilience of the marsh and the resilience of the people who depend upon this land that was filled hundreds of years ago, that used to be a river, that they now live on. But I think what the non-answer to your question is really, it's always so context dependent, and it raises deep questions of equity, because often these conversations about people who are right on the coastal edge, it's also conversations about, where should we be investing as a country? Mm-hmm. What's the future? Who are we investing in, right? I think as long as you're really starting from the perspective of who benefits and who are you investing in, I think that's how you tease out that question of marshes and walls.
So I gather the decision has not been made about what to do about that marsh?
When I worked for the city of Boston, we did the East Boston Climate Resilience Plan. And one of the things we recommended was an elevated berm along a street called Bennington Street, which would protect the Blue Line, it would protect people from flooding. But the challenge really is, what's the future of the marsh? The marsh can slowly climb up that elevated berm. A berm is just kind of like a giant pile of dirt that's very well organized, and it keeps water out. The marsh could climb up that berm, maybe, but it's kind of an open question. And ultimately, the decision you have to make is, what can you really do?
I love questions about, what are the lessons? And so what I want to hear from you, Liz, is what should we be keeping in mind when designing what are called nature-based solutions? I'm glad you brought up the Great Green Wall. It began 15 years ago. Very ambitious, 8,000 kilometers, 11 countries, But in that time, 4%, I think, has actually been afforested.
And there's 15% through, but still, not. You're right, not
a lot since 2005 when this was first proposed. And there have been lots of challenges. Insecurity in the region being one of them, funding being another. So what lessons can you draw, either from that or from other nature-based solutions, about the things that we have to, keep in mind when designing these things?
That's a great question. And I think we have to admit that some of those countries that the Great Green Wall is trying to go through are extremely difficult places to work in. Partly because it's such an arid region across the Sahel. There's reasons why large parts of northern Senegal, Mauritania, why we've seen such migration, conflict in many cases as well. It has not been the most secure region of the world, and it is the source for quite a lot of climate refugees that we're seeing also going to other parts of the continent. So I think that one thing, there's a number of lessons that we've learned from doing nature-based solutions not in the right way, I would say, or calling everything nature-based solutions, right? You've got to ask yourself, what's it a solution for, One of the biggest challenges we've seen, honestly, is the fact that as much as it's really wonderful to plant a tree, it feels great. I love trees, but we've done it wrong so many times. We have planted so many trees, the wrong tree at the wrong time in the wrong place that doesn't belong there, or wrong time of year. And in many projects, more than 50% of the trees that are planted, they may just die and not make it. And so that happened also at the beginning of the Great Green Wall Initiative, where with the best of intentions, go out, start planting trees, but they're just not going to survive. That's one lesson, is just to learn our lessons about what belongs where and what's going to have the highest chance of survival. But it's not just about the species of the option you're using, like a tree, it's also about involving the local community. And if you haven't talked to that community or involved them in the benefits that you're trying to get from that forest, for example, and people in that community need that wood to heat their homes or to eat, then you will not be able to convince that community to keep that tree in the ground. I wouldn't do it, and you wouldn't do it either if you needed to feed your family. So we have to involve communities in those solutions and make sure that they are benefiting from what that nature-based solution is trying to do. And if we don't do that, NBS will fail. There's no doubt.
Trees are great. Trees also burn down. Many of them have, in wildfires exacerbated by climate change. So I want to turn to you, Professor Lackner, because you don't do trees. You do...
mechanical trees.
Yes, you do very unnatural solutions. So here's what I want to ask you. You've been at this, as you said, for a long time. There are, correct me if I'm wrong, about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide are emitted annually?
Roughly.
Roughly?
I think it's 36 or 37.
Okay. $500 a ton is the kind of going price, as you mentioned, in the
unaffordable.
Iceland project. So right now, of these 40 billion tons of CO2, roughly, how much is actually being captured?
Millions. Most of it in point sources. The direct air capture folks right now is a brand new technology in the kilotons, so they are per year. So they are a million times too small. There's no question about it. But that also is what gives me hope that the price can come down. Because if you think about it for a moment, this is where photovoltaics or wind energy was in the 1960s. And in order to get 100 times cheaper, they had to grow by taking the standard rule of thumb, which says every 1,000 times growth is a factor 10 in price. They had to grow a millionfold, so they had to grow from kilowatts to gigawatts. And these kind of technologies have to grow from kilotons to gigatons, but since they only have to get 10 times better, one could hope that by the megatons they are there. Now, it's affordable. Now, there's no guarantee in this world. Let me just point this out loud and clear. Like, natural solutions can fizzle out, so can technical solutions. Right? And one of the things you might point out is the technologies which were successful, they had that kind of cost reduction. But maybe they were successful because they had that kind of, and so we have a very selective bias when we see these kind of cost curves, and maybe this one will not. On the other hand, and here's where I'm an optimist, by the time you grew 1,000-fold, you're still a tiny little player. As a matter of fact, you can just barely feed the US's CO2 consumption for fizzy drinks and what I would call merchant CO2, the stuff delivered on a truck. So, and that, by the way, does fetch $100 to $500 a ton. So you could actually enter that market, and we could, if you ask how much you would have to subsidize this, you're talking hundreds of millions, not billions, because it's such a small market still. So that's why I'm hopeful, but
Right.
it can fall apart. But you now talk about an industry. I said, well, could we get to that scale? A shipping container can do a ton a day. This is sort of where the device sizes are. You would need 100 million shipping containers to get to current consumption. If they break every 10 years, you need to build 10 million a year. We build 100 million cars and trucks a year, not quite in the 90 million we are today, but we are very close to these numbers. Now, Shanghai Harbor ships out 50 million shipping containers a year with stuff in it. So on an economic scale, you are big, you are huge if you do this. This is a new industry on the scale of the automobile sector, on the scale of the aviation industry, but a little smaller than the energy industry.
You know, look, the big question around all this is the pursuit of this technology and the huge amounts of money it requires and the huge amounts of energy it requires, is it a license to keep polluting? And
No.
how do you respond to that?
No, the answer to that is, well, that was a great question to ask me in 1980. Right? By now, we are too late on every front, and we have to put this in as fast as we possibly can. This is not an excuse to procrastinate, quite the contrary. I would argue I would nearly turn this on its head and say, if you say, well, we shouldn't do that because it tempts people to procrastinate, you basically closed one big solution, and which is an important player in the total potentially, and now you actually slowed things down. And I think nobody should say it's my way or the highway. We should all figure out how to solve the problem, and people who say you can't have solution X because solution X is not in my world picture, I would say you are not taking climate change seriously enough. I had this discussion with people before. If I didn't believe it's really, really harmful, I wouldn't waste my time on something as boring as direct air capture.
We're getting audience questions coming in, and there's one kind of interesting one, and I propose that we do just a lightning round on this because it's an interesting question. We've heard a lot about, like, we need a Manhattan Project for the climate, okay? So the question is, lightning round, if you had a Manhattan Project kind of thing with that kind of money, right, what would you start on first, Sanjay?
Yeah, that's fair. I actually don't know. I think one of the things that we often don't do in the climate space is ask communities, what problems are they facing, and how do we connect what we're doing directly to the challenges that they find to be the most pressing, right? Climate change doesn't rise in any respect to be the highest challenge that folks will put on their survey, but they are scared about their housing, their transportation, their future, their savings, and so I think I would want to ground that Manhattan Project-esque thing in kind of how are we tackling several crises at once? How are we connecting this to be meaningful to people's lives so it's not some kind of elitist kind of climate guilt project, but it's actually getting to the real things that people have been facing for decades and need help on today, and connect it to climate from there.
Professor Klaus Lackner.
First of all, I would say we need more than one Manhattan Project, because
You have one Manhattan Project. What's
Okay,
the
I have
first
mine.
thing you start?
I would say I'll retire from what I'm doing right now. I am going to take all of that money and I apply it in the following way. I believe that mass production and many small tries is the most likely way to success. I would say I'll buy now CO2 from you from direct air capture, and I'll give it to fizzy drinks in the short term. In the long term, I want it sequestered. And I will pay you your lowest bid. And I will eat the difference because at the back door, I can sell it for $100 a ton, maybe for sequestration, but I'll pay you the lowest bid. Once you did that, and I got you to megatons, maybe you can run this a bit without my help.
Lis Bernhardt?
I think that working for the UN, I can't propose anything that would be like the Manhattan Project, to be completely honest with you.
It's been proposed by a member of the audience.
But here's what I'll
start
say
with?
to be sneaky around this answer. I would propose something that has the same initials and is also something the U.S. championed, which is a Marshall Plan. What we need is to put that money towards a global Marshall Plan for climate change, which would protect the most vulnerable, help them rebuild, and really put money towards innovations, scaling them up, building them, checking what we know can work. Can we just scale that up as much and quickly as possible?
I'll sign up on that.
Right.
Here's a question from me that's related to a couple of audience questions. Sanjay, you mentioned the importance of behavioral change. Is there an example of a behavioral change initiative that has worked somewhere? And could it help answer the question that always comes up, which is the what can I do? What can we do? What can my family do? So is there a behavior change initiative where there has been a turnaround?
I think one kind of fun example of like a micro behavior that I saw this example in Sydney. There was a team developing some mapping products, and they were like, hey, it turns out it's hot in Sydney in the summer. If you want to get from point A to point B and stay cool, here's a map that optimizes for being cool. And it sounds kind of like, okay, that's a fun app or whatever, but it's the right direction, right? It's saying, how do we take a person, their experience, their health, their well-being, connect it to climate change and bake it into something they use every day, which is a mapping product. I think that's the direction a lot of climate work needs to go, is just make it intuitive, just bake it into what people are already going to do, so they didn't even know that they just did something positive. They just did a positive behavior change towards climate adaptation. They just were more comfortable getting to the grocery store. And I think that's the kind of thing that I want to see more of.
Did you want to say something, Lis?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, now I was
On
just
that.
thinking a lot about behavioral change. And
Yeah.
I was laughing because I bike to work. I'm maybe a very brave soul, but I bike to work in Nairobi, and I live in a place where I can bike to work. But oftentimes, I'm biking faster than the cars. The cars, we've got tons of cars on that road. Some of them work for the UN. Cars are backed up. And I started thinking, why don't more people bike? And I would just talk to people, and everyone's got a great excuse. There's like 70 excuses. It's too hot, and I get too sweaty, and I work too late, so it gets dark before I get home, and all these things. And one of my friends at UNEP is a cartoonist, and she started drawing these funny behavioral change cartoons that she put up in the bathrooms all around campus, so that people could think about it while they have some free time. But basically, each cartoon had a different excuse in the thought bubbles above the heads of the people in their cars, and it was kind of debunked, right, by the person whizzing by on their bike. And I think what we have to do to really affect behavioral change is give people lots of reasons to do the right thing, right? You'll feel great. You will get some exercise. You're not polluting the air. It's great for your mental health, and it's cheaper. And, and you can pick one of those reasons, any one of them. We just want you to do the right thing. Right?
So that's your top individual action for mitigation. Is there a top individual action for adaptation? An
individual action for adaptation. So I work in water, and I have to say, most of the impacts that we see from climate change are actually in some way kind of just changes to the water cycle, right? It's more water, it's less water, it's water at unpredictable times. I think what we should all be doing wherever you live in the world is living as if we're already in a water scarce world. So you should be saving water wherever you are, even if you think you've got enough. Use less in your homes, use less to grow your food. Don't pollute it anyway, that's kind of a no-brainer. But I think that that's, for me, the number one adaptation measure that we need to take some more urgently than others.
Do you want to say something about individual action?
Sure.
For mitigation and adaptation?
Adaptation, I'm not quite as clear on, but on the mitigation side, I said we need regulations, but before we have regulations, we need volunteers. And I think as you wake up, think about your carbon footprint and try to pay it back. The moment you pay, you may actually do less of it. And just think about it that way. Every time you take a shower, every time you drive somewhere. And maybe we should have a button on the pump and say, I'll pay for my CO2.
Now, top one thing or two things that every local government can be doing for either mitigation or adaptation or both. Sanjay, I want to start with you. You're the local government guy.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so local governments, I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. I wrote many plans that had lots of actions, but I think some of the two most important things. One, this is a long-term game. This is not something that's solutionist, right? It covers every single part of the challenges that city governments face. You need to be building the capacity of people in your community to understand and interpret and act on these problems. So that's through kind of stakeholder groups, education, capacity building, governance work, inviting people in for decision making. You said one thing, I'm trying to say that this is all one thing. Because I think ultimately it's about training up that next generation that trains the next generation. This is a long marathon we're running, and a city that really invests in its people and invests in building that internal capacity and civic governance capacity is going to be able to solve all of these much more effectively.
I mean, I have to say, promote nature-based solutions. I think that it's just kind of a given. And there's so many options of what that means, and so many cities are really taking the lead, oftentimes faster than the countries they're based in, to do that. Some things are easy or easier, and they just make tons of economic sense. So planting one tree, for example, that tree on a sunny day can cool as much as 10 air conditioning units, right? It's kind of a no-brainer. The city of Los Angeles is painting its streets white, for example. Many cities are greening their rooftops with so many benefits for doing so. There are things that can be done at fairly low cost that just need to be incentivized and encouraged. Working in water, one of my what I think we need to spend a lot more time and attention on is not trees, but wetlands as a nature-based solution. If that park or that field was meant to flood because it's connected to a river, let it flood. Wetlands actually hold more carbon globally, twice as much as our forests, right? So keep it wet, re-wet, dig ponds. That's what Switzerland is doing. They've seen half of their threatened frog species return in the past 20 years just by digging ponds. It's that easy. Make it wet, keep it wet, and it can do a lot. So nature-based solutions.
I love coming back full circle because we heard Sanjay Seth talking about also the challenges of wetlands restoration if it takes away public transportation. That's, yeah.
We are, at the center, we are working with groups in northern Arizona, Flagstaff, for example, and we are talking with them about solutions to become carbon neutral. And a big push there, of course, is to go to renewable energies. And included also is the question of how does the city become carbon neutral, and do we buy offsets? What are the right kind of offsets, and what are fake offsets?
Right.
So there's a lot I think you can do to drive this on a community level. And I think that's very important.
We are out of time. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with at the end of a very rich discussion, at the end of a very rich day?
I'm happy to start. I think this can be a very grim conversation, right? It can really affect your mental health to think about climate change, to think about the challenges that we're facing. I think the most important thing to remember in this work is that there's a whole team across the world that is all like growing by the day, trying to work on these issues. And it's a relay race, right? It's something we're going to be passing from team to team, from generation to generation for the next century. So it's never too late to join that team, but two, remember to take care of yourself, because this is a space that can be very depressing, but there is still a lot of opportunity to do good work.
I can tell that you're at the EPA. I can take that message up as the UN's EPA. We can't give up hope, and none of us can give up hope, and we need all hands on deck. One thing that I think is super exciting is there is an entire decade that we are in. We've just started, but it's a decade on ecosystem restoration. We launched it last year. It's an entire movement around the world that you can be part of, and I invite all of you to go onto the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration site to see what's happening all over the world to protect, conserve, and restore our nature. We need the best possible scientists in that work. We need the best possible students. We need the best possible plumbers and journalists, and whatever your job is, we need you to be part of that movement. So that is a message I can give you. Just don't give up hope.
You have heard earlier that from a technology perspective, the problem actually has a solution. I think right now we have reached the point, the solution is horrible right now because nobody ever asked for it, and there's a lot of learning that needs to happen to get it into good shape. On the other hand, I think we have reached the point where we can demand that carbon needs to be in balance, and the world has to figure out how to do that. And my bet is that in the long term, we will abandon fossil fuels over that and be entirely on the renewable side, which may not mean that we gave up on all liquid hydrocarbon fuels, because if you take CO2 from the air and you can make hydrogen from water with renewable photoelectricity, you end up making any liquid fuel you like. We can still have airplanes. We can actually probably, over the next 100 years, have energy more and more cheaply than we have today. And I think we should not give up on energy because the world desperately needs it. We need to clean it up.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for your contributions and for answering all my questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Somini, for leading that thought-provoking and hopeful session. I'm going to ask if you can all take your seats in the audience, and I will try to do my best to summarize the day, at least highlight the main themes. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Liz. And Sanjay, if I may. Thank you. Thank you. So, very thought-provoking and interesting and hopeful day, actually. So what are the main themes? And I'd like to steal from Somini her bullet format. So one, what was a main theme? Climate change affects everyone, everything, but disproportionate negative impacts the poor, the marginalized, and people of color. 2 degrees higher temperatures on average cause drastic outcomes, extreme weather events, flooding, disease, adverse health outcomes, as we heard, mental health as a consequence of extreme heat. 3, most damage is caused by first world affluent countries. Most negative impact, however, is suffered by the others. 4, climate change exacerbates already existing inequities. Multiple problems to solve at once. This needs a multi-pronged approach. And I'd like to thank Juan for drawing our attentions to resilience. He reframed or allowed us to think it in a different way. Calling people resilient obscures the need for justice. Let's not glorify resiliency, but we should demand accountability. Solutions. Link climate activism to solving other problems. Job development. Talk to people like they talk. Learn from voices that are diverse. And there are many possible futures. We were offered many possible futures. But one theme that rang true for me, and I will out myself, I am an optimist, Liz, okay? So I'm with you on that, was hope, especially so in the last session. And some of the speakers this morning, and I paraphrase even though I'm using quotations, but what they said about hope is that the story is still being rewritten. Hope is often missed. And what I've learned from maybe more than one of the speakers was that to imagine a better world, imagine it with more passion and empathy. And I'm putting this in quotes because I think it was a direct quote. Not only to think about a problem, but to feel it in your heart. And with that, I say thank you on behalf of Ido and Becky. And it was, I used the word probably joyful too many times, but it was a real joy working with Ido and Becky on this program today. And how can we thank the speakers, even the speakers who came remotely from everywhere? It is really an honor and a delight to be here at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. And I want to thank the staff. Without them, really, we would all be stumbling over ourselves. Thank you again, and I wish you all a good night and a good weekend.